The clay people, what Sumer actually said about where humans came from. A drawer in a museum basement holds a piece of baked clay smaller than your palm. Nobody has looked at it in decades. It has a number on it, a shelf, a little slip of paper describing it in 3 words. And on its surface, pressed into the mud 5,000 years ago by a hand that turned to dust before Rome was a village, is a sentence that has never once been read aloud by anyone alive today. That is not a metaphor. That is an inventory problem. There are more cuneiform tablets sitting unread in museum storage right now than there are scholars alive who can read cuneiform at all. Somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million tablets exist in collections around the world, and the number of people on Earth who can fluently read Sumerian is smaller than the number of people who work at a single mid-sized company. That gap between how much was written and how much has been read is the real starting point of this story, and it matters more than anything that comes after it, because everything that follows depends on you understanding just how much of the ancient world is sitting in the dark, waiting. So let's start with the clay itself, because the clay explains why any of this survived at all. Around 5,000 years ago, in the flat green land between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, in what is now southern Iraq, a civilization did something no group of humans had managed before. They took a language, an actual spoken language with grammar and nuance and jokes and arguments, and they figured out how to press it into permanent physical form. They cut reeds into wedge-shaped tips, pushed them into wet clay, and built up symbols one impression at a time. Then they let the clay dry in the sun, or in some cases baked it hard in a kiln, and the words became stone solid. This writing system is called cuneiform, from the Latin word for wedge, and it is generally considered the oldest writing system we have solid evidence for anywhere on the planet. The people who built it called their land Sumer, and their cities had names that still sound strange and heavy when you say them: Uruk, Eridu, Nippur, Ur, Lagash. Uruk alone, at its peak, may have held tens of thousands of people behind mud-brick walls, at a time when most of the rest of the world was still living in small scattered settlements. These were not primitive people scratching symbols into rock. These were city builders, canal diggers, tax collectors, poets, and astronomers, and they wrote down almost everything: harvest counts, marriage contracts, court disputes, shopping lists, love poems, and, crucially for us, the explanations of where the world and the people in it came from. Here's the part that should genuinely surprise you, because it rarely makes it into the popular version of this story. The Sumerians and the Babylonians and Assyrians who came after them, all of whom kept writing in this same cuneiform script for close to 3,000 years, did not describe the creation of humanity the way most people assume ancient religious texts do. There is no gentle garden scene where a god breathes life into a peaceful new creature out of pure love. Instead, in the most complete and most studied of these origin texts, an epic scholars now call atrahasis, the story starts with a labor dispute. The text describes junior gods, called the Ijiji, who are stuck doing the exhausting physical work of the universe, digging canals, hauling dirt, keeping the rivers running so the senior gods can be comfortable. After 40 years of this, the story says, the junior gods go on strike. They surround the house of the chief god at night, and they burn their own tools, and they refuse to keep digging. It is, quite literally, one of the oldest labor uprisings ever recorded, thousands of years before anyone wrote the word strike. The senior gods panic, because someone still has to do the digging, and that is when the god of wisdom, usually named Enki or Ea depending on which version and which era you're reading, proposes a solution. Take some clay, mix it with the blood of a slain god, and shape a new kind of being, humanity. Not a companion for the gods, not a beloved creation in its own right, but a replacement workforce. A being that would inherit the exhausting labor, so the Ijiji could rest. That is the actual, textually attested origin story from Sumerian and Babylonian tradition. Humans were made from clay and divine blood specifically to dig canals and grow food and carry loads, because the gods who had been doing it were tired of doing it themselves. It is a strange, almost uncomfortable story to read with modern eyes, because it is so blunt about what humans were for. There is no grand cosmic purpose in it beyond utility. You were made because someone needed the digging to stop falling on them. Now, before this starts sounding like some hidden secret that got covered up, it's worth being honest about something. None of this is secret. This isn't a suppressed discovery. Atrahasis has been known to scholars since tablets containing it were excavated and translated starting in the late 1800s and continuing through the 20th century. You can find full academic translations of it in university libraries, and, these days, freely online. Assyriologists have written entire careers' worth of papers dissecting exactly this myth. What has changed recently isn't that this content was secretly hidden and only now revealed. What has changed is how much of the surrounding material, the thousands of smaller fragments that touch on the same themes from different angles, can realistically be cross-referenced by any one person. And this is where the actual, verifiable, non-speculative part of the story gets genuinely exciting, because something real has been happening in Assyriology over the last several years. And it doesn't need any exaggeration to be interesting. Research groups, including a long-running international project called Electronic Babylonian Literature based out of universities in Germany and the UK, have been building machine learning tools trained specifically to help with two brutally difficult tasks: reading damaged or worn cuneiform signs that human eyes struggle with, and finding joins, meaning separate broken tablet fragments held in different museums that once belonged to the very same original tablet. Historically, finding a join meant a scholar had to somehow remember or guess that a fragment they were looking at in, say, London, might physically fit with a completely different fragment sitting in a drawer in Berlin or Chicago, based on nothing but memory, luck, and decades of accumulated expertise. It is exactly the kind of matching problem that pattern recognition software is good at, and exactly the kind of problem that no single human, no matter how brilliant, can fully hold in their head, because the raw number of fragments is simply too large. So machine-assisted matching is real, it is actively being used, and it has genuinely helped researchers reconnect pieces of texts that had been sitting in isolation for a century. That is not science fiction. That is a legitimate and fairly quiet corner of digital humanities research. What it has not done, at least not in any way that credible Assyriologists would sign off on, is uncover some new secret meaning contradicting a century of translation work, or reveal a hidden layer of the text suggesting humans were literally engineered like a piece of hardware by beings from beyond the sky. That version of the story, the one where ancient tablets are reinterpreted to describe genetic manipulation, alien overseers, and a covered-up history of the human race, comes from a different tradition entirely, a strand of fringe pseudo-archaeology that has been circulating since the 1970s, largely traceable to authors who took real Sumerian words and stretched their meanings well past what the actual grammar and context support. It's a compelling story precisely because it's built on top of something real. The clay is real. The myth of humans made from clay to labor for the gods is real and genuinely startling on its own. The translation difficulties are real. But the leap from an ancient myth describes humans as created to do hard work to ancient tablets encode a literal historical record of bioengineering by extraterrestrial visitors, is not a leap the evidence supports, and reputable cuneiform scholars have addressed and rejected these claims directly and repeatedly over the decades. So let's actually sit inside the real myth for a moment, because it doesn't need embellishment to be strange and moving. In the Atrahasis epic, after humanity is created from clay and divine blood, things go well for a while. Humans multiply, farms produce food, cities grow. And then something happens that the text treats with total seriousness: humanity becomes loud. The exact phrase used, translated across different versions, describes the noise of humanity as disturbing the god Enlil's sleep. Not humanity's wickedness, not humanity's violence, its noise, its sheer growing presence in the world, becomes the problem. Enlil, annoyed and unable to rest, sends first a plague, then a drought, then a famine, each time trying to thin out the human population, and each time Enki, the same god who helped design humanity in the first place, quietly helps humans survive by warning a particular man, in most versions named Atrahasis, about what's coming and how to endure it. When none of the smaller disasters work and humanity keeps growing back, Enlil finally decides on something total, a flood meant to erase humanity completely. Enki, once again working around the other gods rather than through them, warns Atrahasis in advance and tells him to build a boat, to seal it, and to bring aboard his family and animals. The flood comes, the world is scoured clean, and Atrahasis survives, becoming the ancestor of everyone who comes after. If that story sounds familiar, that is not a coincidence, and it is one of the most well-documented cases of textual influence in the ancient world. This flood narrative, along with its cousin the Epic of Gilgamesh, which contains its own extremely similar flood account centered on a man named Utnapishtim, predates the biblical flood story of Noah by well over 1,000 years. Scholars widely agree that these Mesopotamian flood traditions, developed and copied across Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian versions over roughly 2,000 years, either directly influenced or shared common ancestry with the later Hebrew account. This isn't a fringe claim, it's one of the most solid findings in comparative ancient literature, confirmed the moment the Gilgamesh flood tablet was first translated in London in 1872 and famously reduced its translator, George Smith, to a state of near breakdown in the museum reading room when he realized what he was holding. What's genuinely worth sitting with, without needing to dress it up as a hidden conspiracy, is what this story reveals about how the Sumerians and Babylonians actually thought about being human. They did not see themselves as the center of a loving cosmic design. They saw themselves as an afterthought, a practical solution to a labor problem, made from mud and leftover divine substance, tolerated as long as they were useful and quiet, and periodically threatened with erasure the moment they became inconvenient. And yet, running directly underneath that bleak framework is something almost tender, the god Enki, the maker, repeatedly choosing to protect the very beings he helped design out of necessity, working quietly against the wishes of the more powerful gods. Again and again, flood after famine after plague, simply because he does not want his creation destroyed. It's a strange emotional core for a 5,000-year-old text to have, and it says something real about human psychology across the ages, even in a story where people are described as tools made for labor. Someone, something, in the narrative logic insists on caring whether they live. There's a smaller, later text worth mentioning here too, the myth of Adapa, a wise man given knowledge and reasoning ability by Enki, who is summoned before the sky god Anu and offered the bread and water of eternal life. Enki, for reasons the text never fully explains, warns Adapa in advance not to eat or drink anything he's offered, fearing it will kill him. Adapa obeys, refuses the food and water, and in doing so, unknowingly refuses the one chance humanity is ever offered at immortality. Whether Enki's warning was a mistake, a test, or a deliberate choice to keep humans mortal, the text simply does not say, and scholars still debate it. That ambiguity isn't a flaw in the translation. It's very likely intentional. Mesopotamian myth is frequently comfortable leaving its gods morally unclear, capable of both protecting and limiting humanity in the same gesture, without ever resolving which one they meant to do. None of this needs artificial intelligence, hidden histories, or extraterrestrial visitors to be worth your attention. It needs only what it actually is, one of the oldest sustained attempts by any group of humans to explain, in writing, why we exist, why we suffer, and why the world sometimes seems to want us gone. The honest tools being used today, digital cataloging projects, fragment matching software, high-resolution imaging that can finally make out worn-down signs the naked eye missed for a century, are slowly doing the unglamorous work of connecting more of these broken pieces together. Not to reveal a secret buried by history, but simply to let more of what was always there finally be read by someone, for the first time, after thousands of years of silence. So if you take one thing from all of this, let it be the plain fact sitting underneath the whole story. A civilization on the banks of two rivers looked at their own existence 5,000 years ago, and told themselves they were made from clay to do hard work, that they annoyed their makers by simply existing too loudly, and that they survived a flood meant to erase them only because one god quietly refused to let them go. You don't need to invent anything on top of that. It's already one of the strangest, most human stories ever pressed into the earth.